Welcome to another AQR Literary Hour when we get to hear and see Alaska Quarterly Review contributors read their work and chat a bit. You can find recordings of the previous programs on our website at aqreview.org and on our YouTube channel. And because AQR could use your support, consider a donation or a subscription or both. They make nice gifts too, and there's back issues available on the website as well. Welcome. My name is Heather Lendy, and on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, that's the volunteer board which supports the Alaska Quarterly Review, and our hosts, the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center, thank you. Thank you for being here today. Gunash, as we say where I am, on the rainy banks of the Chilkat River in Haines or Deschutes, as the Tlingit have called their beautiful homeland since time immemorial. Now I'd like to introduce Ron Spatz. Ron's the co-founder and the editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska, a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow, and a recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. Under Ron's 42 years of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created strong connections between our state and the larger literary community in the United States and abroad, and also been influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues. And there's always a photograph on the cover. Ron?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Please feel free to watch any of our prior programs and to share them. Alaska Quarterly Review is committed to presenting these programs without charge and to showcase vibrant and diverse new and emerging voices and literary conversations with depth, complexity, and humanity. Like all literary magazines, AQR depends on grants, tax-exempt donations, and subscriptions to operate. If so inclined, donations and subscriptions are gratefully welcomed on our website. That's aqreview.org. Before we begin, I'd like to make a few important acknowledgments. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. Alaska Quarterly Review also makes this land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage's Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the language spoken by the traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land, and land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. Now to begin, Heather Lendy will introduce today's featured writers, Ann Kyer, Mary Kudenov, and poet Bruce Bond. Heather is the author of 4 books of nonfiction, all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, and her recently published Of Bears and Ballads. Heather is also the current Alaska State Writer Laureate. Heather, back to you.
Thanks, Ron. It's my pleasure to introduce the 3 writers we have today, and I'm going to go ahead and introduce everybody at once, and then we'll begin. Bruce Bond is the prolific author of 28 acclaimed and award-winning books. You've probably written another one by now, including most recently Blackout, Starlight, New and Selected Poems, 1997 to 2015, and since 2018. Rise and Fall of the Lesser Sun Gods, Frankenstein's Children, Dear Reader, Plurality and the Poetics of Self, Words Written Against the Walls of the City, Scar, Behemoth, winner of the new Criterion Prize in 2020, The Calling, Patmos, winner of the Juniper Prize at UMass of 2021, Liberation of Dissonance, Nicholas Schaffner Award for Literature in Music from the Schaffner Press in 2022, Choreomania, and Invention of the Wilderness. In addition, to Alaska Quarterly Review, his work has appeared in many journals and anthologies, including 7 editions of the Best American Poetry. He earned a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from Pomona, a Master of Arts in English from the Claremont Graduate School, and has a Master's in Music Performance degree from the Lamont School of Music at the University of Denver. He worked for several years as a classical jazz guitarist and still is an avid guitar player, and music, especially jazz, remains a major influence in his work. He went on to earn a PhD in English from the University of Denver and has taught at the University of Kansas, Wichita State University, Wilfrid Laurier University in Canada, and today is Regents Emeritus Professor of English at the University of North Texas. Bruce Bond, who says, "While I'm always using my personal life, characteristically in disguised form, I'm drawn likewise to the sense of movement from the local and personal to the meditative and cultural. As I've gotten older," he says, "I think this movement feels increasingly organic, and I have more confidence that I can trust my instincts without eschewing the larger ambitions that felt so problematic or self-important when I was young. Reading widely is huge to me," he says, "as is becoming alert to the daily flood of all that crosses the eye and ear." Mary Kudenov is the author of Threadbare, Class and Crime in Urban Alaska from the University of Alaska Press in 2017. Threadbare was also selected as a University of Alaska and Alaska Pacific University Book of the Year in 2019 for its portrayal of community resilience. Her essay, A History of Smoking, was cited as a notable essay of 2016 in the Best American Essay Series. And her first published essay debuted in Alaska Quarterly Review, and subsequent essays have appeared in Fourth Genre, Chautauqua, the Southampton Review, Bio Stories, and others. In Threadbare, Mary trained her wise eye and used eloquent words to explore the dark side of life here in Alaska. The people in her essays struggle with poverty and middle-class aspirations, education, minimum wage work, God, and psychology. As the Alaska Dispatch noted, Threadbare is about the other Alaska reality, one of domestic violence, DUI arrest, sexual assault, suicide, and always substance abuse. And it's written by someone who escaped but still feels tied to this world, even if no longer a part of it. From that loneliness, David James wrote, however, has come this remarkable and remarkably compassionate work. For too many Alaskans, this is an everyday reality, and it's good that someone has told a few of their stories. Yes, indeed it is. Thank you, Mary, for writing it. Ann Kyer's essays appear in About Us, essays from the Disability series of the New York Times, 1966 Journal, the Kenyon Review, and other venues. Maple Lane was on the list of notables in the 2014 edition of Best American Essays, and first published by AQR. Act Two, an excerpt from her memoir in progress, appeared in DeWitt Henry's The Woven Tale in February 2022. Another excerpt, The British Cure, was published in the Gettysburg Review. Barefoot is in Chautauqua in fall 2021. And her short memoir, Home with Henry, about befriending a stray cat and what makes a home, is out from PS Books. She's been interviewed on NPR and has been a fellow at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, and has a PhD from Harvard and an MA from Oxford. You can learn more and read her essays and poems at Ann Kyer, KAIER.com. Ann Kyer, who says, it's become fashionable to tell a disability story in a hopeful arc, where the heroine may have moments of discouragement or fear, but comes out into full life at the end, into mainstream schools, love and romance, full participation in the social world. Although I have done that, she says, and had all of these, I still now and then allow myself to hide. I refuse for a while to encounter the world. And Anne is going to begin. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a wonderful thing to encounter the world via the Alaska Quarterly Review tonight. So thanks very much to the magazine and also to Ronald. So I am going to read part of, a very small part of Maple Lane. which is the essay that Heather told you a little bit about. And it is the ultimate narcissistic essay because it's an essay about being born. I was born, literally, I was born in Pittsburgh in September 1945, right at the end of the Second World War. And I was born as what is called a collodion baby, which is to say I had a sheath of skin around my whole body. I kind of looked like a turkey in plastic wrap. And the reason for that is that I have a genetic disorder. So the skin cells don't shed normally. They pile up on the surface, even in the womb. So I was born a very sickly child. I hasten to add, I have had some medication since then that has helped me a lot. But this is a recessive problem like blue eyes. So the parents don't usually know, my parents certainly didn't know that their baby was going to be born with this difficulty. My mother, who lived to be 100, told this story about my birth again and again and again. And one night, part of what she told was that in Pittsburgh in 1945, there weren't enough nurses in the hospital to feed me. And I had a twin brother who was not affected by this difficulty. And so she decided, what was she going to do? How was she going to help these children? And I thought, oh, she's making this up. This is self-aggrandizement, which is kind of like her. But no, I went back to Pittsburgh as a good nonfiction writer. I did my research, and I saw in the annual report in 1946 at Allegheny General Hospital that she was right. The nurses had the number of nurses on the floor to look after kids was very small because the nurses were all off looking after veterans who had just come home from World War II. So she was right about that. One of the other things that she told me when I was an adult, looking back on my birth, was she said to me, I could have let you die when you were born. No one would have blamed me. Well, that was hard to hear. And I thought to myself, why did she not let me die? And she would never answer that question, even when I asked her about it. She was very cagey. So when I wrote this essay, and it's a long essay, so I'm only going to read part of it. One of the things that I tried to understand was why did she make the decision that she did? Because she wouldn't talk to me in the middle of an essay, which is basically nonfiction, there is a part which is frankly fictional. So that's what I'm going to read to you this evening. This happens in a suburb of Pittsburgh in 1945. Tall, deciduous trees beginning to turn yellow swayed over the sidewalks on Maple Lane on October the 5th, the afternoon my mother came home to a suburb downstream on the Ohio River, 12 days after giving birth to her twins. 2 blocks away, the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad ran parallel to the river, carrying troops home from the European War. My father, a lawyer for the railroad, brought her into the green shingled house, and they waited to see what would happen in my incubator in Allegheny General Hospital. What went on in that house during those long October weeks? My mother has given me no detailed reminiscences, so I have to root my way back into my parents' emotions and thoughts as they waited. Although nothing is more mysterious than the inner workings of a marriage, even to, perhaps especially, to a child of that marriage who has never married herself. I imagine these scenes because I want to know how they felt about me when I was an infant, because I'm pursued by my mother's comment about being so ambivalent she could have let me die when I was born. her feelings that no one would have blamed her. Scenes flash through my mind's eye. Monday night, October 22nd, 1945, Maple Lane. Facing the only window in a gabled room, she pulls on the metal wheel of her sewing machine. As she feels the needle puncture the seam of an infant's sleeve, she hears her husband come in from the bedroom. He pauses in the doorway. "Sewing burial clothes?" he asks. He leans against the door frame and ties his flannel bathrobe around his compact hips. "Oh, Ed, really?" The comment surprises her. Is he making a bitter joke? If so, it's not like him. By nature, he's an optimistic man. She depends upon it. "What am I supposed to do?" she says. "Why even think about burying my children? No one else does." He regrets it immediately. "Oh, Pat, I didn't mean." The night air blowing across her table ruffles her pattern. What would her life be like anyway, Anne's life? He lifts his eyebrow, clenches his teeth. He can't answer her. She pushes the pedal again, feeling the motor thrum on the sole of her foot. Looking down at the blue sleeve, she says, "I don't know why this had to happen to us." He notices scratch marks on her left hand. When she's nervous, she sometimes rakes it till it bleeds. He's never sure how to comfort her, but he knows the doctors will never let her handle Anne with an open wound. She waves her left wrist, making no attempt to hide the marks, and asks him to hand her some silk thread. He walks behind her, smelling her face powder, a hint of cologne. What's the brand, he wonders? Something French. She was the first woman he'd met who wore real French perfume. He hands her the thread, then sits in the deep corner chair under the eaves. There's no way to make her care that thread is rare in wartime. She takes the blue spool off the top of the singer. They weigh less now, the kids do, than when they were born a month ago. Isn't that always true with new babies, he asks. She jerks her body forward on the red vinyl chair, rethreads the needle. She looks awful, Ed. Those scales, they wouldn't let me touch her today. He rouses himself. I guess the hospital's afraid of infection, Pat. What might be brought in? By me, you mean? He lifts his eyebrows quickly. By anyone from the outside. Eddie, my little boy, he makes tiny sounds, she says. Folds his leg up under his chest. She pushes her chair back, digs her hand into the pockets. What can we do, Ed? There are children. Could be our only children. She turns and looks straight at him, but he flicks his eyes away. Pretty soon she'll be pacing, asking why this had to happen to her. He hates this kind of mood, and the last thing he wants is a discussion about why they haven't had children before. At first, he was glad she didn't get pregnant right away. Later, he suggested she talk to her doctor. It was easy to accept the doctor's advice to be patient. He watches her change threads and start on a pink jacket. Drumming 3 fingers in the air, he remembers how his own mother mourned his 2 older siblings who died before he was born. She insisted he mention them when she heard his prayers at night in the little room upstate in coal country. She'd tell him he had a look like his dead brother, only she'd whisper, "You're a fine, handsome lad yourself, my boy, aren't you now?" He can still hear her slight Irish cadence. His father could never console his mother for the children she'd lost. God knows I don't want Pat to feel that way, he thinks. On his feet now, he fiddles the fingers of his right hand as if he were playing an invisible piano chord. It'll be risky to bring her home too soon, Pat. Who said I was thinking of that? She lights a cigarette, inhales, then grinds it out. I don't know what to think. He straightens up. Have you called around about hiring a nurse? He knows it's always better to give her something practical to do. When Anne's better, you could get someone in here to help. Maybe Mrs. Rooney, who looks after that flock of nephews of yours, the little hooligans running wild down in Squirrel Hill. She might have a friend or something. His hand is on the doorknob. Give it a whirl. She hears him close the door behind him to blot out the clatter of the sewing machine. He hates noise, she thinks, and he won't fight. She knows he dislikes anything like a scene. Bending over her task again, she reaches for the back of the pink jacket. Heaven knows when I could put this on, little Anne, she thinks. She remembers seeing plaques of thick skin modeling her baby's thighs. I can't bear to think of how much it must hurt her, she thinks, that tight skin. She pulls away from the machine for a minute. Might it be better if she died looking like that? What kind of life would she have? No man would want her. She leans in again, works the pedal. I'm only 32, she thinks. I can have more children. That's what people say. You can have more children. Then she stops sewing and throws her head back. But what if we don't? With the heel of her hand, she polishes a clean spot on the table. Face facts, Pat. This was your first pregnancy in 5 years of marriage. She scrapes her metal chair along the pine floor, gets up, goes down the staircase, out the front door, down the porch steps, moving quickly into the late October night. She's vaguely aware of shimmering porch columns. A large dogwood tree shakes purple leaves in the wet breeze. She strides past it, twists off a clump of red berries as she goes. What if I never get pregnant again? What if this is our only chance? She walks across the grass towards the driveway, kicking up divots with the toe of her shoe. The boy will survive, she thinks. I didn't do anything wrong there. All he needs is to be fed. She scrapes her open-toed shoe back and forth along the bricks that line the driveway, letting her hair fall in place. It's Anne, that cracked skin. What if it's something She pushes the thought down, jerks her body upright. Look at Eddie, she says out loud. He's proof enough. She walks a few feet along the driveway. I could just leave her there, let her take her chances. No one would blame me. She tosses the berries aside, starts to scratch her left hand, but stops herself, digs her hands into the slanted pockets of her dress. That baby seems to have a will of her own. A smile creeps across her broad teeth. She laughs quietly, kind of like you, Pat. She brushes the low branch of a white pine, scattering raindrops. Suddenly, she feels elated. I can do it. She throws her long brown hair back and opens her face to the light rain, letting it sink into her cheeks. Then she shakes the wet out of her hair and walks along the driveway towards the street. All I have to do is get them home, where we can feed them. She pushes down the thought that she might not be able to tend a baby who's as sick as her daughter. Ed, my husband, he may protest. I'll just explain it to him. At the end of the driveway, she slows down. Maybe the skin problem won't last, she says. Anyway, we'll find doctors, take her to Philadelphia, to New York. She paces down the sidewalk for a few yards, hearing the wind rush through the tops of the maple trees. Then she turns towards the house, walking quickly up to the porch, past the white columns. After all, she thinks, it's only dry skin. So that's the end of the excerpt. And she went back to Allegheny General Hospital. She took a laundry basket, a wicker laundry basket lined with newspapers. She brought my brother home. He gained weight, and she went back for me very triumphantly. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Anne. Mary, it's your turn.
Mary, I think you might be muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I'm going to be reading from The Origin of Light, which came out in 2017 in Alaska Quarterly Review. And it's sad, so I'm going to skip around just a little bit to keep it down in time. But there's half of it is a personal essay, and it switches to lyric essay. And it goes back and forth. And my mentor, the late, great Sherry Simpson, was a wonderful ruminator. And I was just not able to get this essay to come together. And it was a couple years after I graduated that she helped me build the last piece that kind of bridged between the lyric part of it and the nonfiction essay side of it. So hopefully you can spot that. It's near the end. The Origin of Light. A scrap of paper fell from a student's display board as she walked out of the Learning Resource Center, distracting me from the conversation at hand. I leaned against the payphone outside the university's writing center where I tutored, listening to my mom talk about the weather back home. If there was more relevant news, she would save it for the end of the conversation or not share it at all. I wanted to talk about my brother until I understood what happened. I called my mom almost every day. I told myself it was to check up on her, remind her that she still had 2 living children. But the truth is I was running out of people who could bear the guilt that I wallowed in. The real conversations burned inside me. The guilt, Mom. My mother could avoid guilt. She took refuge behind the facts. Seth had struggled with depression. He was a logger who had lost his leg at 24. And during that same colossally horrible job, one member of a crew, a woman he cared for, died of propane poisoning. Seth was exposed to the same gas and afterwards resembled Lenny Small. He felt responsible. He lost the lawsuit and declared bankruptcy. He spent the last 14 years of his life in a scat-encrusted shack, terrified of losing more. Anyone listening to our pleasant conversation would never guess my brother had killed himself 3 weeks earlier. My mom chatted about Whip and Judy, the blacksmith and his wife who lived at mile 22. They'd been visiting her just about every day, and it was a little like talking to a person from a different era, or maybe a character from historical fiction. She lived in a small rural town, and her friends had occupations like knife maker and railroad worker, and postmistress Martha kept everyone abreast of the latest gossip. I listened to her for a while and tried to contain my own bad mood. The strip of paper had fallen from a student's display board, caught my attention again. It was a little scrap about the length of a finger, pastel and distinct on the sea of beige Berber. It held a command written in round, bubbly penmanship that I associated with missionaries and elementary school teachers. It said, "Be the light." And I imagined the kind of person who could write a sentence like that. Someone who ran marathons and held intangibles like bliss or serenity as daily goals. I picked it up and considered the hideous weight of that single imperative sentence. As I said goodbye and started toward the writing center, another wave of students passed the payphone, vibrating with laughter and enthusiastic conversation, pulling books from their bags without ever stopping or slowing down. I was barely there. I knew that much. I watched them as if from a great distance. The phoenix lives in Arabia, near a deep, cool well. Each morning, as dawn turns the early sky pink and gold, it bathes in the clear water and sings so mellifluously that the sun god stops to listen and weeps. Only one phoenix can exist at a time. When the well dries, when the dawn brings only charged clouds, when the horizon vibrates with thunder and the phoenix feels death approaching, it builds a nest of aromatic wood and sets itself on fire. I had to stop worrying about you for a little while, Seth. I didn't know what could happen. A new phoenix will spring from the fire and embalm the ashes of its predecessor in an egg of myrrh. The new phoenix will be strong. It will carry the burden of its body into the city of the sun. In most cases, it's the family who cleans up the mess, the bits of hair and teeth. My living brother and I removed the sofa, but a family friend, Becky, spared us the worst of it. Still, decisions had to be made quickly. Mary Beth, what should I do with the brain? Becky asked me. The paramedics took the body, but a large piece of the brain had fallen behind the couch. I don't know, Becky. I can't think about it right now. Can you just do something with it? Maybe I should have buried it or something, Becky whispered to me at the wake. The brain, I wrapped it in a plastic bag and I put it in the trash. I can't think about it right now, Becky. For months, I didn't drink. I exercised and I took care not to abuse my body. I sought counseling. Yet grief stripped my memory of day-to-day details and I recall little, with the exception of an undergraduate poetry workshop. The small class sat at a round table and I faced a 19-year-old Cure fan, thin, dyed black hair, tall boots, and tight jeans. And he read aloud in rhyming couplets of feeling hollow inside, of ravens swooping and falling and announcing the corpse. Black Roses and Armageddon every Thursday night that semester. And I could indulge in the angst-ridden Sylvia Plath tributes, the insincere fascination with mortality. But some nights that boy wore a white t-shirt with fake blood around the collar, a theatrical garment, red and glue droplets spilling down his chest, and it whispered to me, my head is gone, my head is gone. There was a time when everything was still and all of the spirits slept. Australian Aboriginals call it dream time. The planets revolved around the sun and the moons around the planets and the cosmos spiraled outward. The universe moved like a machine, but all of its inhabitants were still. The Sun Mother woke first. She came to Earth and walked in all directions, and in all the places that she treaded, spirits rose. She penetrated caves and crevices with bright light. She glided north, her heat melting the ice, forming the rivers and the streams of the world. All living creatures watched her in awe as she moved across the sky. I think we were there, Seth. And when she finally disappeared beneath the horizon, we were terrified, thinking that she had abandoned us. Some of the others froze in fear, not moving all night, wondering if the end of time had come or if they were having a nightmare. But after only a few hours of darkness, the Sun Mother came from the east, luminous and comforting. The Earth's children learned to expect her coming and going and were no longer afraid. I read of a woman who was terrified of the Vincent Thomas Bridge in Los Angeles. The temptation to throw herself off is so great that she moved across the country to gain a safe proximity. I feel that way about darkness. The same empty room, plain with lamplight and white walls, fills with ghosts and bones the minute I flip the switch. Light is an Alaska industry. We weigh it like gold and track it like stocks. I thought winter solstice was the bell curve of suicide deaths, but actually most suicides occur near the equinoxes, before winter and before summer. On average, 1% of people in the United States will commit suicide. In Alaska, where Seth and I grew up, the average is double. Winter mornings, I'd swallow vitamin D tablets and sit under a special light meant to ward off seasonal affective disorder. The radio, the news, the daily paper weather reports announced highs in the upper 30s, lows in the mid-20s, and 4 minutes and 55 seconds less daylight. My mom's friend Whip died suddenly of a heart attack in December, and within hours, his wife Judy drove her car into Kenai Lake, which was just beginning to freeze. The Moose Pass town had filled for their wake, and Whip's best friend Virgil, the knife maker, read Longfellow's The Village Blacksmith to the stunned residents. It had been almost 20 years since Whip and Judy had moved from Fairbanks to Moose Pass after their own son's suicide. And after the service, a small group of us headed to the lake shore behind Whip and Judy's house. Virgil and Judy's sisters cut open the plastic bags holding the remains, and I will never forget this, Seth. Whip's ashes were black and Judy's nearly white. And before we left, Virgil threw Whip's hammer into the water, but I didn't see it ripple. I was watching all their expressions because they looked so hopeful, like they were expecting the catharsis of ceremony, except Mom, she was looking for you. In the beginning, there was only the holy darkness, and it was the darkness that released the holy light. God formed vessels to hold this light, but there was a miscalculation. The vessels were not as strong as God had thought. They split and shattered, a cataclysm so devastating that it birthed the suffering universe. Light and ruins, and maybe even God himself, tumbled down toward the realm of matter. Kabbalist mystics say we can help God by freeing the light, raising the sparks back to their original unity, tikkun olam, restore the broken whole and heal the world. Edith, a 67-year-old woman from Nebraska, saw the light. She moved through levels where the souls of the living work things out. She only came back because her grandson would have been orphaned at age 7. Edith had never read Dante's Divine Comedy or the Tibetan Book of the Dead. She'd rarely left the farm. If it weren't for the boy, she wrote, I'd have stayed in the light. Another man coded for 1 minute and 53 seconds. He emerged on a beach, felt grains of sand between his toes, and spotted a thatched hut in the distance. Inside, his deceased parents looked 50 years younger. They touched him, and he felt their touch, and he was reunited with his best friend. Then the light came from under a doorway and drew him in. When I mentioned that the scriptures of my faith did nothing to soothe my grief, a counselor suggested I research near-death experiences, an activity that comforted her when her own mother committed suicide. Since then, I've read hundreds of accounts from people who've returned after being pronounced dead, and I see 2 common threads. When the dead see the light, they feel as though they are returning to something better. They often express frustration that there is no sufficient way to describe the unity they experience. It's like a chair trying to understand a table, one woman tried to explain. Or it's like trying to explain algebra to a chair. She abandoned the metaphor. The body just isn't big enough to hold the knowledge. The brain is inadequate. The vessels are not as strong as God thought. Creation stories have false beginnings. They actually start in the middle, where there was already word, already God, already forces in motion. Seth's suicide is my before and after point, the catalyst that pushed me out of East Anchorage and into graduate school, the single event that made me realize life could not go on as it had been. Seth had called me the night before he killed himself. He sounded confused and spoke in a low rumble. I messed up real bad. I messed up. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't say the right thing. The weeks and months that followed were some of the worst of my life, but they formed me and still form me. The book of Job, considered the book of wisdom, opens with God and Satan in a dialogue. God claims Job as a perfect servant, and Satan asserts that Job is only faithful because God has given him a blessed life. In the chapters that follow, God reclaims all of Job's blessings, his wife, his children, his possessions, to prove something, the reader assumes. Job is often cited as the Judeo-Christian answer to suffering. And when he calls down to speak to Job from a whirlwind, God doesn't say why he caused Job to suffer. Instead, he asks Job a rhetorical question. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? As though the answer to suffering is threaded into the act of creation, and part of Job's ignorance lies in his humanity. Word and light reside in God, the book of John explains. God sends the light into the darkness, and the darkness cannot comprehend it. The first children had no memory of light. They knew the world by other senses, heard the trickle of water, felt jagged edges of rock, smelled the minerals of the cavern walls. They tasted the slime and cold of the creatures they ate, and they were content. After a long darkness, long after the first mother disintegrated, after thousands of dreams, so many dreams that he couldn't determine waking from sleep, the boy sensed something. He tried to tell his sister what he saw. What does it feel like? She asked. What does it taste like? But there were no words yet for illumination, or shape, or color. He could only describe how the light filled him with longing. He tried to walk toward it, but he didn't know where it came from. He grew obsessive, looking for its origin. One night, while sister slept, brother found the source. It seeped from a small crack in his hand. And when he pulled his skin taut, the light increased. He nudged and pulled his skin up until it split the length of his palm, and the cavern's creatures drew near. He saw their shapes and colors. He rolled back the skin of his hand and forearm to release more. He looked for a while at the cave walls stretching into the darkness, endless as time. How could he know there was anything else? The boy peeled back his skin until his hand lit the cavern like a torch. And while the boy worked off his flesh, his sister slept by the bare white bones of their mother. Sinew by sinew, he unraveled his muscle, shedding his body in one glorious purge. And he was the first to see his own blood and beauty. He was the first to see and to leave the world full of light. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary, and I'm sorry for your loss. Bruce.
Wow, that was fantastic. I might change what I'm going to read because that was so powerful, and I too have written about the book of Job. But I'm going to start with something new. I am working on a book called The Crawling Eye. Crawling Eye was a movie made in the 50s, a really bad sci-fi movie, but incredibly creative. I decided to write about a book about the 1950s and 60s somewhat. It skips around a little bit, but I thought that it might serve as a kind of distant mirror. In many ways, of course, we're very different from the 50s, but it too was an age of extreme fear and tribalism. And so those moments of connection that I note here, from my childhood, are kind of against this foil of what's going on in politics and popular culture. I'm just going to read a fairly short one called The Future, which tentatively is the first poem in the book. Stars call from a distance we measure in light, the thought of whom enlarges the brain as the soul inside it dwindles to a particle. So now, when we search a sky, we search our origins that look a little sad in light of the violence and total lack of remorse. Then that first freak moment of coalescence. From a sea of particles, the God who holds the whole landscape together. You, me, we raise a line of sight without discernible beginning or end. Just an eye in the middle, an island of light, with the ache of the empty chair we talk to without end. We know the gods one day will leave. Constellations will fall into disrepair, but others will arrive. Our lives will not be perfect. Then one day, a president dies. One night in a parking lot, we will talk among strangers, bound by thread you otherwise see between the stars, unaware the gods are there. I should actually say something in gratitude to Ron and the Alaska Quarterly. Ron published me over 30 years ago when I was very young. I remember the poem. It's called Insomniac's Creed, and I was so honored and touched, and I sort of needed the support pretty extremely at that point, being on the job market and so forth. And I followed the Alaska Quarterly avidly, and I've always been inspired by what they do. One thing they do that very few journals do is they publish long poems. And I've been the beneficiary of that practice. I'm not going to read long poems today for obvious reasons, but I am grateful for the Alaska Quarterly, all they do, including serving this somewhat underserved genre, the long poem. To me, that's a very special genre. Okay, so I'm going to just read Relatively bite-sized poems from a number of books to give people maybe a kind of exposure to some of the things I do and maybe some of the opportunities for purchasing these things. I'm not very good at marketing, but I do my best. One of the books that's forthcoming is entitled Liberation of Dissonance, which is a phrase sometimes translated Emancipation of Dissonance. It's associated with Schoenberg. The opening of this book begins with a meditation on Schoenberg and others. But the book I'm going to read today is entitled Bells. Wind with barely a world in its path makes no sound. And then the banner lifts and flutters. The one hand claps. Bronze comes invisibly to life. And the startled temple mourns the missing hand. Who here is not a child of bells? They blow to song the abstracts of men through the open garret. Who is it now, I wonder, and the bells turn back to stone. Today, I watched a movie of the killing. I thought, perhaps it would make me wise, responsive, or in excited horror prone to see suspicion blown into a monster. I am just one hand after all. A man is there. I do know this. Bones of light, flesh of shadow. And as the gun goes off, the wind of the known trajectory blows an abstract of men through the open lesion. Who here is not a child? Fire moves through broken windows and the figures in a riot, and the names get taken down or lost. Night burns, embers graze the eye, but the movie does not change. Characters are cast in bronze this time, committed, bound to mistakes they made or suffered or deepened by neglect. Those who walk the tear gas go unseen. Some are pulled aside, questioned, searched, and never found. Others hang in the heart of the bayou like bells, and no one hears. Some walk the pathless walk of bronze in the tower, forward and back, the stride of the breath and the broom and the hasp of the flag beaten into wind and cinders. However singular the bullet and path of light, the door in the body swings both ways, in and farther in. The banner claps the air, and somewhere men prepare the body for the viewing. Flowers release their ghost. Overhead, you hear the silence on which a music lies. It is template hard, cold, steady as the embalmer's table. Say the window is the one hand, her open bed the other. The bronze that strikes her from her nightmare is the bell. I have felt my own music overfill the vessel of the killer. Whatever the misconception, it is looking for another. A word to strike, a mirror, a wall. And now the movie has come down offline. The children are sequestered. The gunmetal river goes cold. Wind with barely a world in its path fills and empties the needles of the valley. Where there is a breath, there is an obstacle in its path. America touches no one in particular, and so a little of all. It cracks as men in grief and office do. Every bell is two bells, one silent, the other made of words that so miss the world they ask. Look, they break us open, and then in tired voices break, so full of promise, they cannot find us. One of my books forthcoming is entitled Invention of the Wilderness. This is a poem for a friend entitled Paradise. When a tree falls and no one is there, it falls into the earth below. I hear it. I hear it again. In my last picture of Lisa, we are drinking coffee and she says, my mind keeps going off into the future. What if it is nothing? She is bald, pale as birch, and her worried beauty shadows my cup and version of that word, nothing. In a smaller picture, we are children together, almost in love, awkward with unspoken things. I thought it came to nothing, and here we are drinking decades later, making plans for an autumn without leaves or people. She has a fridge full of pot. She laughs, medicine, and I do not see quick behind her charmed eye the many trees on fire. Or if she sees, I do not hear them if she leaves for the subway tunnel, having said the thing we never said, the otherworldly in the word love that does not, cannot happen. Perhaps it did long ago in silence, and in the sound again of branches falling where there are none at all. Okay. And one of my books is entitled Choreomania. I'm going to read the title poem from that book. Choreomania, if you don't know, is basically dance fever. The word chorus comes from the word choreo, as in choreography, meaning dance. During the plague, evidently there were outbreaks of choreomania, and people broke into collective dancing, some so furious with it, they actually collapsed, died. An entire bridge collapsed at one point. It was a very freakish period. It happened over the course of about 100 years and then eventually faded out. So this is called Choreomania. Those were days a plague of flies swept the village, and the quarantine slipped into obscurity or worse, when there was only so much a gravedigger could do to keep up with demand, to load and unload what he managed before he parked his shovel at the door. Only so much we could take before it came, the news of yet another epidemic, a contagion of mania, of joy, of the appropriated look of joy, mobs of dancers who, without warning, broke out in furious rituals that went on for days, that swept up ever more indigents and kids, more lookers on, and ended in collapse, death even, by exhaustion mostly, or by drowning, as when the bridge gave way over the river Moose, and those who danced above the water went down en masse. Call it belief as disbelief, the power that comes from faith in the others or in the individual the crowd sets free, like the wingspan of a scream. If some folks stooped to rude displays, copulations in the street, obscenities hurled at the great stained glass, blame what you will, it changes nothing. Little is more infectious than cruel laughter when the time is cruel, the mother tongue infected. But that is not the whole story. The extremities know what it is to feel the sluggish heart grow distant. They know it takes an exercise of will to want, to will again, to raise the curtain. And sometimes you fake it to get things started, to move a little blood around. These gestures in the air are a kind of waving to one another, to the relish in a stranger's face. Your hands know they have no future in them, and still we read something there, a trick, and yet a sweet pretense to take up one another's palms, searching for fates that get more hopeful as we go. The love line deepens, the lifeline grows, longest in our dotage. The Dance of Death is one of those old movies full of folks who don't exist, save in the theater's dark age, the living dead recalled to the stage to do a bit of damage, break a lantern here and there, shock the elders, beat their goatskin drums. They do what madness compels a body to feel the heart grow larger, more imperially afflicted, like eyes that see a lover's nakedness for the first time. A team of horses will tell you if a storm is coming, heads high, nostrils flared. A mountain shadow falls across the village and the makeshift pyres rise. From nameless corners of the woods, the stench sweeps one soul of blasphemy, another of contrition, or darkens to a cloud that blows the children home. You know the feeling. The heartbeat stamps in its stable among the carts and blunted shovels, the grappling hooks. It could go on forever, forgetting what it's made of, the legs that would move it, as it in turn moves them, doing the long, hard work of a necessary trade. The mass graves are damp with life, a dervish of limbs. There is a better world, says the bell that batters the sky it hangs in. And then it shudders for a while. And sometimes when the death cloth slips, when the flies ignite and lift a little higher, the heart stops to watch, to listen. And sometimes it gallops on and on. Okay, so I have some recent books, one of which is this one called Scar, and it consists of 3 long sonnet sequences. I'm going to read just one sonnet from each sequence. The first sequence is called The Lost Language, and much of it is about music. When I was too young to remember, I had no name. I was alone in paradise. I know this, but who am I? Too old to call back the hands that carried me to bed. I call that world my world. And when I talk, the world calls me you in my mother's worried voice. Her hand on my forehead, her scolding, her twitch, the thankless chores, they worry my words before I speak them. My world before I had a world was scared and pushed a face ahead to bear the blow. When I was forgotten or feared as much, I woke. Without the language yet, I breathed. I wept pure music and would not be consoled. And this is from the sequence called Scar. I dreamt my cat slept across my thigh, her head on my knee, and when she woke, the world appeared to her no different than a moment ago when she dreamt. No less nameless, our eyes, ourselves, she said, believe me. I had my doubts as well. Half the time she talks, all I hear is music. All she wants is music in return. Then I woke up and I had no cat, not that cat. It had been years now, and the world appeared as it was a moment ago, but silence was thicker, loss a presence, a feeling of too much, a radiant surge taking back the shore. And the last sequence is based on Dante. I was interested in looking at the internet as a kind of underworld, only instead of being rigidly concentric, it is without center. When I was young, my teacher left the room, and when she returned, she was not my teacher, but a child. I did not know enough to grieve or to go wherever a better child goes. I felt what I felt, and mostly later, in the light of TV faces that lined the streets of the Republic. I thought, so this is what a nation is. What I felt, I heard in the soft drum and the hooves of the cortege caisson that bore the casket of our president. My mother too watched perfectly still until she called me and wiped something from my cheek, a thing she never did. One of the books that came out last year is this one called The Calling, which is very different. It's written in a kind of open form. It's one long poem. I'm just going to read a page. The gun that takes the elephant down, the roar of the great beneficent beast, and the dust that rises, the slave who saws through the cream of the ivory, the 5 men bought to carry, the 1 in 5 who dies of exhaustion, the roar of the great beneficent wind and the spume it raises, the long sea journey, the 1 in 5 ships chained to the dead who go down with it, the look of the drowned in the living, the open eye of the departed, the song of the wreck on the ocean floor. They are bound, all of them, for the grand pianos of Europe, where a composer, an insomniac, beaten as a child, a solitary man, a nervous temper with a hair storm in his prime, will lay his fingers on the white keys whose names dissolve because he is just that full of some vague demand, something he forgot as a boy and never did remember. And the long legacy will pull one direction, written, and the music another, and the oceans will erase the deep engravings of the shore. I'm gonna make this a little briefer than expected. I don't know that I'll have time to read the Behemoth poem. I'm just gonna end with this more personal poem, a shorter one, but know how honored I am to be in the company of these great writers. This one's called Bronze, from the book Behemoth. Tower bells beat the door of the sky, and so call those who hear the toll of marriage or mourning or time passing before the bronze goes still. Today, I hear all those calls at once, leaning from the chamber, a rapture that bears, I know, a given message, though I like to think the music has its own. So too, its own cloud swept through the parapet, where the temple scaffolds rise and fall over the face and stones of a great design, the one I never see. I, a mongrel, married a Jew. My table crowned in candles whose light and honey smokes the air, and they are not mine, these dispensations echoed at the altar, not mine the music of my home, though it marries me to the silence after. Call me a follower then, a mute observer, a bit of stone against the larger burden. I married a battered child, the girl in her broken by her, a stranger, again and again, like a wave inside a shell. Whenever I hear bells, I think of this, unable to say what needs to be said, or hear the broken silence when it speaks. Nights, I am awakened by her breathing, and still I dream. Still, her heart beats its bronze against a sky I cannot enter. And when she moans, I shake her gently. It's okay, I answer. That's all it takes, a stage whisper, and she mumbles, thank you, love you, without opening her eyes. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bruce and Mary and Anne, reminding us that beautiful words and thoughts can come out of very difficult experiences. And thank you all for joining us today for another reading in AQR's 2021-2022 literary series. And on behalf of the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, all our gratitude for the generosity and the courage of today's writers. And as always, to Cody Carver and the Anchorage Museum at Rasmussen Center who produced this program. The best way to support writers is to buy their books, preferably from a local independent bookstore, and to share them with your friends, or check them out of the library. Also subscribing to journals like Alaska Quarterly Review. Ron, the last word is yours, always.
Yeah, thank you, Heather. And I want to thank you again for 2 years of great series that you've joined me, and very grateful to you. Grateful to Anne, Mary, and Bruce. Thank you for your commitment to Alaska Quarterly and for your terrific work. Very grateful to you. I just want to end by saying April is National Poetry Month. We have 2 events. April 8th, we feature poets Robert Davis Hoffman, Marlon Jenkins, and the poetry of the late Eva Saulitis, read by Mara Saulitis. And on April 22nd, we have a National Poetry Month event that is also merged with Earth Day, with great poets, Ellen Bass, Anne Corey, and Allison Hawthorne Deming. So April will be a wonderful National Poetry Month destination at AQR. Thanks again to everybody. Look forward